and we are starting our program. Thank you for joining the Novi Public Library. This is the first part of our mental health series program, and this evening we are talking about the psychological impact of racism. And another powerful subject that we're talking about, we're joined by our special guest, Dr. Crystal Jackson, who is a licensed psychologist. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Jackson. Good to have you with us again.
Thank you so much for having me, Gail. It's so good to be back.
Good. I'm really encouraged and inspired about this series because it's covering a number of topics. We're just starting off with talking about racism, but we also are going to talk about on December 17th, how are the kids? And then January 7th will be supporting frontline workers, and January 14th, man stress, you're not alone. So we're all over with different issues that are impacting us now and always, but it seems like now with COVID, it's even amplified. And Dr. Jackson, you and I were talking about this just before we went live about how things that we've been dealing with for so long seems to be much more impactful now, including racism. So that's our focus for this evening.
Yes.
So let's jump right in and talk about what's going on today and racism again. I guess people are saying, here we go again, racism never going away, right?
Well, I think that's what makes it a great and important topic to have, because it's not going away, right? It's been around for for those of us who read the Bible. It's been around since biblical times, right? In some way, discrimination, racism. So it continues, but I think that the important thing that we learn from in our history is that we only overcome what we are able to acknowledge. And I think that's the first step. And being able to be open to the idea of hard realities and being able to accept those, I think, is the very first step. You often hear that phrase being used of acknowledgement as the first step. Well, I think that's applicable in any situation in life. And that includes with the issue of racism. I know that I've talked to so many people, especially this year, because I think it's been so much in our face, in the world's face. I think there are also those of us who may feel like, well, this has really been going on forever. It's always been a part of my world. But for another subgroup of people, or, separate group of people, for them, I've also had people tell me, I thought we made so much progress, and I didn't really realize this was still an issue. So you have so many different views and opinions about racism and what's going on, and the ability to be aware of it, I think, is different within different people as well. So I think it's an important topic.
I like what you said already. You're only able to overcome what you're willing to acknowledge. And that's a really powerful statement in and of itself. Acknowledgement actually is the key. And I think more people, it seems to me, are starting to acknowledge racism. Are we making some progress, do you think?
I think we are definitely making progress. When we think about the history within our country and where we've come, we've definitely made progress. What I like to say to people, however, is that making progress is good. However, I tend to use a lot of analogies, and I found that in communicating with people about issues of racism, that the more analogies I use, somehow it makes it easier for them to understand, especially if I'm talking to someone who may not have a full understanding or awareness of of what has happened in our country and what continues to happen in our country. So I use the example of being a part of an abusive relationship, right? So if you have a spouse, man or woman, who's being abused, and the other spouse says, well, I used to hit my spouse like every day. Now I only do it like 3 days a week, right? Like once a day. I used to do it several times a day. I'm making progress. I don't know of a person who would say to that spouse who made that statement, okay, great, you're good. Like, we don't have any issues because you're making progress. I think that using that analogy, when people hear that, what I've experienced is that that analogy by itself opens up the eyes of people to understanding the way in which a lot of Black people, African Americans, feel when that phrase is used of progress having been made, because we're in a position where we're saying, yes, it has been progress. However, it happening at all is not okay.
Wow. Shot progress right out, didn't we? What is progress? You know, that, right. I get it. That good example there. I certainly understand where we're coming from. So then what now? What do we do? What can we talk about here in terms of psychological impact? Because I don't know if people really make it a connection with being psychologically impactful. Is that
Yes.
but how is it?
So again, because I recognize over time that the discussion of race can sometimes bring up personal feelings, and people can, have their own opinions about things. So I really do tend to speak in terms of analogies to try to help people understand the impact of racism. So the impact of racism is just like any other traumatic experience. Okay. So when you are constantly being confronted with any traumatic experience over time and over history, whether it happens to you directly or indirectly, it still has an impact. And one of the things that we know about trauma is that oftentimes it can present itself in ways of depression or being anxious. Sometimes panic attacks will be manifested and within a person's demeanor. And so we have this psychological impact, and the reason for that is because it has never completely gone away. It's constantly peeking its head out and resurfacing, or even just continuing to surface over time. So that's now what we call chronic, right? We hear the phrase like chronic headache. It has happened.
Right.
A person can relate to that, or chronic pain. It's something that continues to happen over an extended period of time, which then brings up the word chronic. So for the issue of racism, it's very unique for the African American community or Black community, because it's a group of people where it's been continuous, right? It's not even like it happened for 100 years and we were able to move beyond and it stopped, right? And we recovered and we're done, right? It's all behind us. Sometimes people will engage in conversations. I actually listened to, I don't want to call out the network, but I listened to a news station, and I heard a person say something that was really discouraging. They said that no one who's Black is ever arrested just because of the color of their skin in the 80s and 90s. That doesn't happen anymore. And I thought, wow.
People still think that, huh?
That's one of those areas where people are completely uninformed and they're just not aware. And I don't necessarily think that it's intentional. And some people within our community, they find it hard to believe that it's not intentional. But what we have to understand, as we are living together with all the races and ethnic groups of people, we have to understand that it's hard sometimes for people to understand your position and your experience when they have not experienced it. And I think that again.
So you don't think it's intentional?
I don't think that it's always intentional. Now, yes, sometimes it is very intentional, but I think that it's important that we recognize that it's not that way all the time. And just as we do not like to be pigeonholed as an ethnic group, we should not also pigeonhole other ethnic groups and make it out to be that everyone feels the same way and everyone believes the same thing, because that also is not true.
True. I get that.
Yeah.
I understand that completely.
And so
And I know
some of the psychological components of this, going back to the trauma, is that it's important to understand that the more that we are exposed to a thing, right, a traumatic event, the more reactive and responsive we will become to it. So if you can remember and recall 9/11, And all of the images that were constantly portrayed across the media outlets, all forms of media outlets, whether it was video footage or whether it was just constant conversations and talking about it, kind of playing back everything that happened all over again. Well, that's essentially what happens with racism and some of the current, what I refer to now as like modern day lynching that has happened, is that it continues to come up. So when you're trying to heal from something, but yet you still have injury that continues to happen, it creates a much more complex issue of trauma that a person will be experiencing. And so with using the 9/11 example, what has happened, or what happened then, is that people were traumatized even though they were not there on ground zero. People were traumatized and reached out for therapy services, even if they didn't know anyone who had passed, right, or was a part of the incident. People were reaching out for help, and they had been traumatized because of the constant repeat and replay of the incident. And so I try to use that analogy again to help people understand why it's not very easy for the African American community to accept the idea that, oh, this is something that happened so long ago, just simply get over it. It's not that easy, because what happens is that we're continuing to experience like this constant injury over time. So when you're trying to heal, it makes it very difficult to do that.
One thing I'm not understanding, and I've been hearing it more frequently, is, oh, racism happened so long ago. And I'm wondering, what are people defining as so long ago? When I live in a home where my mom experienced racism, all of her, part of probably half of her life. I'm talking about discrimination, not just the racism that we call today, that's a debate on whether it's racism or not. We haven't had equality legally in recent years. So why is it being called so long ago? Are they talking about the hundreds of years ago when we had slavery? Is that what they're calling so long ago? When I look at the Ruby Bridges, I think it was the 50th, 60th, whatever year of her not even being able to go to school comfortably. This wasn't so long ago. This was in our lifetime. So that's one thing that I don't get when people say it was so long ago.
Yeah, I think that again, Gail, it's that phrase, I think oftentimes it's wrapped up in the other person, the person who's making the statement, their lack of experience. And it's not their fault. And I think that's important to say, is that there is no reason to feel shame or guilty because it's not your experience. Right? None of us had control over what ethnic group we were born into. We didn't get to pick and choose, right? We didn't get to raise our
Right.
hand and say, okay, everyone who wants to be this, or part of this group, raise your hand now.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just not what happens. So there's no reason to feel shame or guilt. But again, it goes back to that acknowledgement piece that helps the situation when you're really trying to be a part of the resolution of something like this. Now, when I say resolution, what I'm really saying is the momentum, the movement to continue to make strides and break down some of these barriers and walls and stereotypes and attitudes of racism and language and behavior that exudes racism as well. So it's not that it's anyone's fault that they were born and don't really have the knowledge to have the understanding. But I think what we're all responsible for is gaining an understanding and being open to the idea of someone else's experience and not debating someone else's experience, because that typically will lead to greater trauma. Can you imagine a person who's been abused and they go to disclose that information to a parent or to someone that they thought they could trust, another church member, and instead of being met with understanding and validation and empathy, they're met with doubt and they're met with disbelief that is extremely hurtful. And so again, another analogy to help people understand the impact of their response when someone is speaking their truth and telling their story and their experience of their ethnic group or even personal experience themselves. I mentioned the remark that was made on a particular national news channel about there, and I think we've heard it in the media. I don't think it's any secret. The news channel I won't mention, like I said earlier, but we've heard this even in the political realm, that there is no systemic racism. And I think that's a mistake. I think that is going into this area of not acknowledging what really is happening. And I also think that I had a conversation with a police officer recently, maybe within the last month. And in that conversation, it came out to me that the police officer for this particular county was unable to speak at school settings about racism or about talking to students about their behavior and how to treat people. And the reason that I was provided with was that the police department did not want to appear as if they were taking political sides.
Dr. Jackson, that is so common. What you said, I've heard that in many arenas. Don't talk, let's not talk about it. Let's keep our area, our city, our neighborhood, or whatever, the peaceful area that it is, and not hit a sensitive spot or stir up something that isn't there. And once again, I think that's probably denial. And what else is that?
Well, I think that another, again, this, when we talk about the psychological impact of racism, is that some of us are raised to believe that it's not an issue. And some of us are even currently, especially now with our political climate, it's so toxic. We believe that if we speak up, if anyone says anything about race, we are automatically associated with a certain political party. And I think that's really unfortunate, because issues of race and racism or ethnicity, it's a civil rights issue. It's not a political issue at all. And so I think that when we start to make it a political issue, we take away the human aspect of simply caring about others being hurt or mistreated. And I don't think that it has any place in a political party. I don't think it matters what your political party is. I think that we should all be bothered when we see another human being mistreated and being hurt. So from a psychological standpoint, what can happen now is now we have issues, what I see oftentimes, with more people coming in to see me because of more of the what has been highlighted now in our country. They're coming in more now with paranoia and lack of trust. I'm seeing agoraphobia. People are afraid to leave their homes because they are fearful that something will happen to them because of the color of their skin. These are real people who are dealing with these real mental health issues, all because of their experience, whether directly or through witnessing issues of racism. So it's real, and these are real clients that I work with, real humans. And I think that for anyone to have to be challenged with second guessing if they can leave out of their house or not and still be safe is a very sad and unfortunate place for us to be, for any human to be in. And I think that if as a culture within our country, if we could all maybe understand that, and again, going back to that validation, empathy, understanding, acknowledgement, awareness, if we can all develop those really simple skill sets, that would take us so far in the direction, so much more closer to where we really want to be with each other.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions rolling around in my head. I don't know where I want to start, but let me talk about what about people who are in superior roles, non-Black, that discredit racism or the validity of racism, even to your face, even to a Black person's face. And I've seen that happen in a number of occasions where they discredit the existence of, or they minimize it. What the feeling initially is probably hurt, and then anger, and then a little more hurt and a little more angry. That psychological impact is very strong and valid as well. Would you say someone who denies the existence of racism or denies a person's experience with racism, are they racist
Well,
or just uneducated, or a little of both?
you know what? There is no hard and quick answer for me to assess if the other person is racist or not. But I think what is true is that it could be a little of both, or it could be one or the other, right? So I do believe that there are people that so for an example, we have this beautiful sun, right, that God has created. And with that sun, it's bright, right? And so most people, or some people, will wear sunglasses, right, to block the sun rays. Whereas other people, they may exist and walk around and not wear sunglasses. It just doesn't bother them. But for those who want to block the sun or the sun rays, it's to prevent it from causing too much pain to their eyes. Okay. So in life, we tend to do the same thing with different issues. We sometimes we choose to put on blinders like sunglasses, right? So that it can block some of the pain that we may experience if we allow ourselves to accept the truth. Does that make sense? So
Yes.
if we allow ourselves to come face to face with the sun, it can be pretty blinding, right? And for some people, if they allow themselves to accept and really acknowledge the truth of racism, it can be very hurtful to them. And so what we do naturally as humans is we like to protect ourselves. When things are too hurtful, we want to protect, right? We want to shield ourselves and protect ourselves because the pain can run too deep. It can cause someone to not only question themselves, but question their entire family history. How impactful is that? I have talked with many people as well who I've had conversations with, as you mentioned, and they started to send me images and video clips that did not support the idea of racism. It was almost like they were trying to show that, well, it's you all do bad things too, right? It was almost like I felt like we were kind of going into a competition of, and that's not where I wanted to go. So I think that what we try to do, and what I try to do and encourage others to do, is just simply educate, right? So you educate, you're not trying to debate a point, because I think that when we get into the area of debating an issue, we get to the point of casting our pearls. Now that's a religious concept, right? So
I get it. I know that.
so casting our pearls upon people who don't value our opinion, they don't value our emotions, they don't value our thoughts. And so sometimes it's not beneficial to engage in conversations when you can clearly see that a person is just not ready to receive. But I think it also is as equally important to understand that it may not be intentional. And I think that's the hardest part sometimes, because that psychological impact of racism, it can bring up a lot of anger in people, and they can start to lash out and act out, and that of course is unhealthy. However, at the same time, just like a child who has been abused and they go to school and they act out, as a therapist, I'll tell you what I'm not going to do first. My first reaction to that child is not going to be to scold them because of their behavior. My first step as a therapist is going to be to talk about their home environment and the abuse that they are experiencing, and work within that family structure to try to relieve and eliminate what's happening, the toxic environment.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's only then where the child will the child be able to even hear what I'm saying. You can't go in directly and start critiquing a behavior when you're not addressing the root cause of the issue.
Got it.
Right? So
As we continue our conversation, I want to just stop right for a second, quick second. For the people who are joining us on Zoom, if you'd like to make a comment, I do see a check mark. I'm not too familiar if that's a hand raise or not, but that person who has that little check mark right there, if that is a hand raise, please feel free to join our conversation. You can unmute and open up your video, and you can ask a question or make a statement. I do see several people that are joining us this evening that could possibly have comments. I see some of the names there, but don't hesitate at all. Use the raised hand feature, and we would love to hear your response to anything that we're saying on this subject, be it related to something that Dr. Jackson has already said or something that you would like to add to. There it is. That was Chavon. That was a hand raise, wasn't it? Please unmute yourself, and we'd like to see you if you'd like to open up your video and hear what you have to say, if you'd like.
I'm actually here. My name is Chavon. Thank you for allowing me to speak. I'm here with my 19-year-old daughter, and we reside in the Novi area.
Mm-hmm.
And we're constantly, and I can say that I've never encountered racism in Novi or its perimeters. I can say that I really appreciate the system as far as welcoming us. And when I say the system, the community has been very welcoming. My daughter has gone through the Novi School District. It's been great. What I battle with as a parent is trying to just get my daughter to understand, because this is a multicultural area, is to try to understand that we're here, yet we're here kind of by, I won't say default, and the people are nice, but trying to get her to understand that she drives to college and so on and so forth, that we have to protect ourselves because this is a fear for us. And we're like, okay, stay on residential streets, try not to be on the dark roads and things like that, because we haven't encountered it. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. I can say I love Novi, don't get me wrong, but racism is alive and well, and I have a child to protect, and I'm seeing the George Floyds and so on and so forth. And it stirs up so many emotions, and you don't want to feel like the person that's your next door neighbor is your enemy. But it's hard because, as Dr. Jackson said, we know what is there and what the possibilities are, and it's frightening. And so if I could just get some help, because I wanted her to hear it from not just myself and my husband, but I wanted her to hear it, that it's not just us. This really is the way of the world, and it's not a great way of the world. And we don't want to be traumatized, and we don't want to feel like, no, you can't go down here, you can't go there, and you can't trust this person. But that is a real fear for Black families, not just in Novi, but in the world today. I don't have a Black son, but I do have 2 Black daughters, and I am in fear of their safety as we venture out into a world that we see people going to our Secretary of State's front door. I mean, like, where does it end? How can we reel it back in to not feel so much fear? Because I have fear, not only for myself, my husband, my 2 daughters, and it's real. It's real.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So if I could just get some help with that.
That is I appreciate your candor. I appreciate you presenting a real issue. This element of fear that is so prevalent right now within our community, and what to do with that fear. How do you not have the fear? One of the things that I can say is, in life, when things are, when we feel like there is a lot of unknown, what can be helpful is try to control as much as you can, right? So, and it sounds like you are doing that, Chavon, by having open and honest dialogue with your daughter. And that's the most important thing that you can do, is to keep her aware of what's in her control. So she can control making sure that she obeys all the laws. She can control making sure that she does certain things, being kind to other people. And I know that sometimes that statement right there that I made, a person, and Chavon, you may be thinking it, or someone else who's listening can audit, their first thought in their mind is, but even if we do all things right, we've been shown that still may not protect us. That's when we go into this area of what's outside of our control. And so if we allow ourselves to remain focused on what's outside of our control, we keep the fear there. We keep it where it is, and it stays in place. But if we can focus more of our attention on what we can control, and then go from there, that's a better place to be, because there will always continue to be, whether we're talking about race or any other topic, there will always be things in life that are outside of our control. And so with those things, we cannot change it. There is no amount of worry that's going to change it. There is no amount of fear that's going to change what is truly outside of our control. So what we do is, honestly, Chavon, what you're already doing, having the open and honest conversations with your daughter, making sure that she controls what is in her control, and then everything else she learns to accept. And she can also position herself to be a part of change, because being a part of change can promote feelings of empowerment that can oftentimes cast out fear. And if it doesn't cast it out, it can definitely minimize it. So if there are areas within her community or even in other cities that where she can be a part of promoting positive change in this area, that can definitely help and cast out, or at least minimize, the fear. Because it's a very unhealthy position to be in when we're feeling like we can do nothing, right? And that this is just the way it is and there's nothing I can do. I don't believe that is true. I do believe there are some aspects of life that we cannot control, but I also believe that it's so important in identifying the things that we can control and doing so. So if there are ways that your daughter, or that as a family you all can get involved and be a part of positive change in this area, I say do that, because that will definitely aid and assist how you all are feeling now.
Thank you.
Good advice. And I understand, Chavon, your position as well. I do have a daughter as well who's 19, and I think just keeping her aware of her surroundings, just as you would in any, if it's a stranger, when you're teaching your children, watch out for strangers, walk with purpose, carry yourself with dignity, know your surroundings, know what's going on around you. As much as people say, don't watch the news, I say, follow up on what's going on in the news so you can know what's happening in the world. Education is the best thing ever. You need to be educated. I'm not saying consume yourself with the news, but you should be aware of what's going on day to day, including history and including current affairs. It keeps you smart, it keeps you sharp, it keeps you, it assists in wisdom. What you learn at home is impactful. You have to be prepared when you go to the workplace, when you're in school, when you're in stores. You need to know something. If you don't know, you'll find yourself in the position of many who are ignorant to racism, to every other thing that's going on in the world, and that just doesn't make you a well-rounded person. So just keep yourself up to daughter to Chavon. Just carry yourself with dignity, pride, and respect, and expect respect.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that's a good step toward progress. Anyone else have anything else to say? If not, we will continue because I know, Dr. Jackson, we also talked about racism is not just something that affects Black people, and we have touched on it some, but let's talk a little bit more about non-Blacks and how that can psychologically impact non-Blacks as well, racism.
Well, what is true is that racism is experienced within all ethnic groups, right? So we know that racism is not just something that impacts those of us who are Black, but it impacts those who are Asian, who may be Native American, who may be Hispanic and white. So it impacts everyone. However, we also understand that there are different degree levels, right, of experience. And so, yes, you have, our ethnic group who may have experienced to a much larger degree this aspect or this thing called racism. So yes, we may have more of an experience with that, but you also have other races that have experienced similar things, maybe just not as much, or maybe not as chronic or maybe even not as systemic as what has been happening within our race, but it definitely impacts all people. One of the areas that as I mentioned earlier, is that when we talk about racism, you can have people that begin to fear Black people because they feel like, oh my gosh, this person is going to judge me. And
absolutely, I hear that all the time. You're so right.
I'm fine. I love everyone, and I wasn't raised to be that way. Which
Oh, I don't hear you. Is it just me? I don't hear you anymore, Dr. Jackson. I'm not sure if it's just my sound, but I lost. Okay, there we are.
Okay, so they're questioning themselves, right? What should they say? What should they not say? If I call someone Black, well, is that okay? Do they want to be called African American? I don't know, right? So
yes.
So you have that as well, and that's real. And what I say to that, to other groups of people, is that, again, you understand their experience as well. It doesn't have to be an either or, right? So it doesn't have to be that we only address the experiences of Black people or our ethnic group of being African American in our history and current state. We can also be able to listen and understand someone else's perspective as well, and that's okay. I think acknowledging and then being conscientious, right? The ABC, acknowledge and be conscientious, I think is the way in which we can create more unity within all groups of people, and we can create internal peace. Because with being conscientious, it means that we're allowing ourselves to be empathetic and be considerate of our actions and of our behaviors. Some people, I think, going back to kind of repeating, but saying it a different way, some people who are, as you say it, non-Black, they don't understand how sometimes their words can have huge impact. So I've had many experiences more recently with people making statements that they're just not even aware that it was a statement that created maybe a very hostile environment, or it had the potential to. So sometimes people are making statements and they're not even really fully aware of what they're saying. So part of that, goes back to this old saying. It's so simple, but I think over the years, maybe we forgot about this phrase, but it's, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all.
Right.
So sometimes we have to just go back to the basics. And I think too, when we are, people often have asked me, well, what can I do? Right? What can I do to help? I don't know what I can do. I'm just one person, or I don't really think that people want to hear from me. I think what helps is when we each identify, as I mentioned to Chavon earlier, the way in which we can help. And everyone will have a different niche, right? Not everyone wants to speak in front of a large group of people and have a dialogue to discuss this issue. But maybe if you're in the store and you're in a grocery store and you see someone do something to someone else, and you know that it was, not okay, it was very overt, and it was very clear and evident that maybe they were profiled. Maybe, you were at Walmart and they checked, you noticed as you were in the same area that they asked the Black gentleman for his receipt to check his groceries, leaving out, but they didn't check you, or they didn't check other people who look like you. What
I
about
see that so much.
right,
I try
right?
not to make that a racial thing. I see that so often.
Small things like
Mhm.
that, if we are, again, more
Yeah.
aware of these little small nuances that maybe before we completely were unaware, we never paid any attention to it, but now being more intentional in our efforts to come together and work together, just like we help out people when there's a flood and we want to go and do missions trips, and we want to gather and support this certain area of the state or of a country when there's a flood or there's a hurricane. It's the same thing that's needed in issues of racism when people are being treated poorly because of the color of their skin. That helps.
Yes.
It matters. And
Mhm.
so when you're able to speak out and say something about another person's behavior being inappropriate, or what they said was totally distasteful. I recently heard someone say to another person, "Oh, you're just acting so Nigerian." And it was shocking to hear that. And it's those type of those statements that depict again a certain group of people in a certain light, and it was a negative statement that was made. And so instantly another non-white person said, "Absolutely not, you will not speak that way." Right. And this was a teenager, so there was an instant consequence. Right there, instant redirection. And I think that was so powerful, but that only happened because that particular non-white teacher was being extremely intentional and extremely conscientious about the impact of the other teenagers' words, right, on other people in that particular classroom or that particular setting. So I think that the more that we can all do our part in correcting poor behavior, the better we are with making progress in this particular area, and the better we're going to be able to heal some of the psychological wounds, right? Because just like in cases where we find ourselves judging a group of people off of a few people's behavior, and we start to judge the whole group, well, guess what? It works the same with positive behavior. So if you show yourself to be mindful and conscientious and intentional with calling out bad behavior, guess what? Now people, when they see that, they start to form an association that not everyone is this way, right? So sometimes our silence can be so loud, and our silence can be so hurtful to people, because it gives the appearance as if there is no care, there is no acknowledgement of the hurt and the pain and the damage that has occurred. So being silent, sometimes people are afraid of, they don't know what to say. They're afraid of saying the wrong thing. But here is my belief, and here is my word of encouragement to people when it comes to having that concern, is that when you know that you are intentionally going to call out something that's wrong, don't be afraid.
That's right.
It's just that simple. It's just that simple. Don't be afraid to call out things that are wrong. That's what we do as a people, as human people. We need to call out those things that are wrong, not make it about politics or political sides. I saw one person, they had something on the internet and it said, "Are you a Democrat or Republican?" And it had like a list of all these different characteristics. And on one of the categories, it had Like maybe you're a part of this party if you approve of riots and things like that. And I thought that was a bit distasteful, because I think that you really can't have a conversation about riots unless you talk about the psychological impact of racism.
For sure. Absolutely. I want to jump in right here because Ebony has had her hand up for a minute. So I'm going to address you. Ebony, please feel free to open up your video and your audio. We'd love to hear whatever you have to say, comment, or question.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Gail. Unfortunately, I can't get on video because I am in the process of detangling my hair. But
oh, I know what you mean. I understand.
but I do have a question, and Dr. Jackson, is great to chat with you again. But I guess I'm starting with a statement, and then I have two questions. In my past, I've often found that when in discussions of racism, and particularly in the workplace, Black people, in particular, I guess you could say people of color, but I feel like usually in my experience, it's been Black people. We end up having to soothe the emotions of our white colleagues or counterparts who feel guilty, rather than being heard and moving forward together with steps to shift away from racist structures and symptoms. So I guess my two questions are, how do we respectfully redirect the conversation back to understanding and dismantling racism without being dismissive? And then the second question is, what are some strategies that can be used in the workplace to help leaders of organizations understand their responsibility to create safe spaces for people of color in predominantly white workplaces, regardless of their personal beliefs about racism?
Two great questions. Thank you, Ebony. The first question you asked about not coming across as being dismissive when maybe in a workplace, and is it okay, Ebony, if I just kind of make that a more general statement? I think that
absolutely.
Because I think some people may feel like your experience in the workplace is what they experience in so many other places as well. It could even be in the church, right? So I think that one way to do that, honestly, is to be very direct. Now, I always advocate for open, honest communication, because what will happen is that if you're not open and you're not honest, then you leave and you're irritated. And we don't want to advocate and promote and encourage or reinforce, a person holding things in that they really need to express. However, the contingency there is that when you speak directly, that you do so, I tend to use the phrase with truth, but also in love, right? So for an example, in that situation, when you're talking about this issue of race with colleagues or with any group of people, and you have someone who's non-Black there, and they start to talk about how they're feeling and their emotions, if in that moment you feel that you are being dismissed, you can simply say that. And that's okay. And maybe that becomes another part of the conversation, that maybe both, maybe it's okay that you're feeling like you're being dismissed, even though they're expressing their feelings of shame or guilt. I think it's okay to say politely, I hear what you're saying. So I think validation is always important. I'm not trying to produce hundreds of therapists here, but I am trying to encourage people to understand and hear what effective communication sounds like and what it looks like. And I think that oftentimes, if we can just take a moment to validate, and then maybe we can move on, right? So, yep, I get it. And then this is how I feel, right? Bringing it back. That's a technique that I encourage, even for an example, in married couples, right? Within married couples, in any relationship, when one person is talking about a concern or an issue, it's most beneficial for that person to have the floor, right? And it's very ineffective, and it begins to create problems when the other spouse, for an example, chimes in and starts to bring up all of their issues, right? And so what I tell people is, okay, it's not your turn. right? Right? Maybe we can have that conversation. Maybe you can have that conversation another time. But right now, this person brought up an issue. Now it's not the time to bring up your issue, right? Because what can happen is exactly what you're alluding to and what you're stating, Ebony, is that the person who initiated the concern, now their concern is being overshadowed or overpowered by this other person now bringing up their concern. And then what happens is that initial concern is never really addressed. That's why it's an ineffective method of communication. Does that make sense, Ebony?
It does. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I would say be very direct in those moments, but being direct doesn't mean that we have to be aggressive, right? Oftentimes when we talk about being honest and being upfront, sometimes we feel like we have to have some edge to what we're saying, or an eye roll or a head shake. And we really don't have to do that. We can speak openly and honestly, but do so in love. And we can also validate what the person is saying, but then also make sure that we're bringing it back to the point at hand. The second part of what you said, or your question, Ebony, was about how can in the workplace that may have, I'm understanding, non-Black leadership, how can we help those persons or that organization or company understand what they can do to help and support this idea of creating a non-racist environment? Is that I want to make sure that I heard the question correctly before I answer.
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
Okay, so again, I go back to being very open and honest with your communication, but also being very mindful of the tone that you use. So something that can be extremely important when you're communicating what you want is to not talk about what you don't want. So you come to the person with solutions. So you can send a very nice email. You can request a one-on-one meeting, and you can come in with all your ideas written out. You can hand over a sheet of paper with all of your points, and you can share that in a very professional, very polite and courteous way, but you're still making your points very clear. Now, understanding, however, this is going to lead me to this other point, Ebony, is that sometimes what can happen is they feel like they have to have like so many meetings about how to move forward with your idea. So I want to encourage you that if you take my suggestion about how to move forward with communicating what a company can do to improve the culture and dynamic of the workplace environment when it comes to race relations, also be ready to be patient. That's really important, because remember, if you're talking to someone who does not have your same experience, it may take them longer to understand, right, your experience. Some people, it doesn't. Some people, they are very empathetic, they validate, they listen, they hear, and they act. And it's not a problem. But that doesn't happen very often. Honestly, what you find is that people need a moment to like process and understand, and they feel like they have to strategically, and you can sit back and say, why do we have to meet like 10 times about this same issue, right? So it can become very frustrating, but just keep in mind that it's all a part of their process. It's what they need. And it's helpful for them to meet maybe several times over before they get to the point of really coming up with something that they think is going to work within their company. But I think that regardless of outcome, I think it's always important to bring your ideas to the table.
That patience part.
That was so awesome.
Talking to me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ebony. I appreciate your questions. I benefited from them as well. Dr. Jackson, I was saying that patience part, you're talking directly to me, because not necessarily with that topic, but maybe some of that as well. But how do you make yourself become a little more patient with things that when you don't see progress? How do you yourself work on yourself to become more patient when you see things that have been going on forever? And now all of these questions are coming up, why and what should I do? And you're just not as tolerant maybe as you should be. and maybe, and I heard you mention about the don't have the anger and the eye roll. While I don't have that, I do know some who have gone to that next level because they've started with the let's talk about it, let's work things out, let's get things better, and then it starts to go up a little higher. Like, okay, what are you going to do? And then it starts to get the next roll, and okay, I've given you X amount of time, and I see no progress. What do you do then to keep yourself under control? I think this is one of those psychological questions. How do you address that?
Well, I think that what we do is we offer what we want. And so in this conversation tonight, what I've talked about is empathy, validation. And so sometimes we have to extend that to others, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have to extend grace. We have to extend understanding. We want people to understand us, but we also have to understand that they may not understand, right? I know that sounds pretty funny to say it that way, but we want them to understand. But we, on the other hand, have to understand that they may not. And it may take them longer to process things than maybe it takes us to process it, because we're experiencing it directly, right? And they're not. And so also what I have learned is that for some people, it's very scary for them to go against the grain. When you're talking about a person who's not Black and a person who's not had this history of abuse or racism coming at them chronically, and then you're putting before them all these wonderful, very helpful ideas, it takes a while, because now they're in a position of having to go across the grain. I mean, to go against the grain. And so again, even with me saying that, I am not putting all non-Black people in the same boat. What I'm saying is that when you find yourself in a position where you are experiencing non-Black people taking a very long time to make change, understand that this is new for them. Now, doesn't mean that everyone, has that same reaction. Some people are very much so on board, and they can move very quickly through that process, and they can say, oh, I appreciate your ideas, and this is great. I'm so glad you brought this to my attention. And then within the next work week, they've already implemented, right, some of your ideas, suggestions, and maybe even more. So this is not to stereotype or generalize. This is saying, in some cases, when you see this happen, it will take you to be understanding and understand that for them, this can be very awkward, because they're thinking, oh my, how are other people going to feel? Again, going back to are they going to think that I belong to a certain political party? Are they, right? They start to have all these different thoughts. Is this person going to still be my friend, losing friendships and connections when they start to speak out about certain things? And so I think what's unique about the African-American community is that because we have dealt with that for such a long time, that our minds don't go there as quickly as maybe another group of people. For us, we've lost so many people, right? Like, we know that people will turn their backs on us because it's a part of our history, right? So it's a part of our history, and unfortunately, we've gotten used to that. Right. So we know that we can lose friendships, and sometimes for us, we can just brush it off and we're like, next, right? I'm just going to stand up for what's right. Like, this is just what we do as a group of people. We have to do this. We have to stand up for what's right. But not everyone has that experience. See, in our family, when you think about family conversations, talking about issues of race and talking about standing up for what's right and fight for what's right, that is truly something that makes our culture, I think, generally speaking, extremely unique, because we have those conversations from childhood. Our parents start us, with that mindset at a very early age, whereas in some cultures, that's just not part of the dialogue in the family. It's not there. So when you're talking about growing up, and now you're an adult and you're talking to other adults that are outside of your race, and why they don't seem to understand, it's because it wasn't a part of their dialogue. It just wasn't there.
Oh, what you said was it's exactly on point, Dr. Jackson. I can relate to that. You're absolutely good points there. We also have another hand raised here. Let's address Carla. Feel free to express your question. You can unmute yourself and open up your video if you like. Everyone's afraid to open up their video. I want to see somebody.
Well, in my case,
If you're comfortable, it's up to you.
in my case, the picture on the screen is way better than what you'll see if I try to.
Oh, there, yeah, that's a good picture. We're good.
I'm a mental health advocate, so I feel like I could say all sorts of things, but my question actually is for Ebony. I'm curious what you meant, because I'm all about seeking to understand, but I'm curious what you meant when you said talking to colleagues and expressing yourself, and you find yourself having to console that other person. I'm curious to have an example of what you mean.
Ebony,
Hi, Carla. I am here.
Okay. Great.
I am happy to answer that, and thank you so much for asking. So there have been experiences where we have specifically, I've had the pleasure of working for a few organizations that actually were, and please excuse my breath, I ran upstairs. But a few organizations that even in our mission, equality and equity were things that were primary for us as an organization. And so oftentimes we would have conversations regarding different communities of color, which often, of course, racism would come up. And then, if a person felt guilty, they would begin to cry, and, they didn't understand, they didn't want to feel bad, and, or pretty much just, kind of expressing, like their sadness, and, they how bad they felt, and, how much better they wanted to be. And it kind of ended up becoming a conversation where it's like, okay, like, where we're like, okay, like, don't feel bad, like, it's okay, like, if you haven't, maybe you haven't done anything wrong, or maybe you have, but where it was like, where we're kind of like, trying to, I guess in a sense, give them a hug and kind of like calm them, where in actuality, like the request for that space was to actually have the people of color who had been experiencing those things to share their experiences. But then most of the time was spent with people of color trying to get those who felt bad for what we were sharing, to pretty much calm down so that we could continue with the conversation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense.
Anything additional to that part, Carla?
Well, I hadn't encountered that, so I was curious what you meant, instead of me just guessing and deciding for you.
Sure.
I think to add a little more context to that, if it's okay, Gail and Dr. Jackson, as I mentioned, I think that the space was, I think, again, very particular, because I think, and that's why I kind of mentioned the workplace in my experience, because I have worked for social organizations where social justice and, again, equity were very important. And so all of us, Black, non-Black, whoever came to the table, there was already a consciousness and an acknowledgement of inequity, of an injustice. And so I think, maybe sometimes having to hear that the people that you work with every day, or the communities that you're serving, or trying to serve, working to serve, are still experiencing these very hurtful things that maybe as a person who is not a person of color, or who is not Black, you're not experiencing them every day. And so maybe, I don't know. And again, this is just me, this is what I'm kind of thinking may have been going on, but, and so being confronted with like, hey, like, this is, like Dr. Jackson kind of mentioned this earlier, this is still very real. It hasn't gone away. I experience it every day. I've experienced it even in this workspace. Unfortunately, sometimes I've even experienced, microaggressions with some of the people that I know, love me, are doing this work together, and we're working together. But unfortunately, because of our different experiences, are not, cognizant that they still could be perpetuating some of those, negative stereotypes and interacting with us, or still kind of pushing forward with some of those microaggressions. And so I think it's just kind of that, like, if you have a friend or somebody that you care about, you don't want them to feel bad. So instead of like staying focused on the topic, we would, start to have conversations about like, oh, it's okay, or, like, don't feel that way, or kind of like talking them through their emotion instead of talking about the things and the experiences that we had.
Ebony, thank you for giving that explanation so much. And if it could, Gail, if you don't mind, I'm really interested, Carla, if you don't mind, you mentioned that you were a mental health advocate and you could say a lot. Is there something that you would like to say or share, or knowledge or experience?
Well, I will say in response to what Ebony just talked about, what I hear is collectively as human beings, our inability to hold space for someone else and to truly allow someone to feel heard and seen and validated. That's kind of, the more you talk, I'm like, okay, this is what I'm hearing and seeing going on. So it just kind of reinforces the work that I do. Well, that's one of the things I could say as far as we all have a need to feel heard, seen, and validated, and how important that is. I mean, in a nutshell, my husband and I are the founders of a nonprofit. We're all about mental health education. And prior to the pandemic, I spent a lot of time doing community events and having a table. The first table we ever did, what I realized was that gave people space to talk about things they normally can't talk about, and how huge of a gift that was. And so I miss those events because I truly enjoy.
I just realized the microphone was on my head. Sorry.
Oh, now I hear you. I was wondering, was it just me?
I put it up because I'm like, oh, I don't need that. Lost my train of thought. Oh, talking to people and hearing other people's experiences and how mental health has impacted them, or suicide loss, or any of these things, and that's how I learn and how I grow and expand my knowledge and understanding, and then try to find ways to duplicate that or repackage that and share that information with others.
That's really good, Carla. I appreciate that. And that's the platform that this is. It isn't really to take one side or the other. It's therapeutic either way. Say what you need to say, and Dr. Jackson is here to address it and put us all on a good path and a good space during this time. So if you have additional comments, I did see, was it Chavon's hand raised again? I don't see it up again, but if you do have something to say, Chavon, please jump in, or anyone else, if you'd like to comment additionally on this topic, whether you agree or disagree, or if you have some indifferences about something, this is the opportunity for you to share in a judgment-free zone, and I do encourage you to do that. Dr. Jackson?
Absolutely. I was just going to say, absolutely. I do as well. I think it's important. One thing that I strongly advocate for and encourage people to do is have, again, I think I just said this earlier, open and honest dialogue and communication. I think having a level of understanding in all direction is how we heal and how we help each other. And again, if there is anyone here who would like to share, Carla, I appreciate you. I don't know, Gail, is it okay to get, Carla's location? I don't know.
I was thinking about that.
That's a resource right there for people, right?
Type me your contact in the chat if you'd like, Carla. Private message me.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that as much as if there's anyone else, as many resources that are out there that allows for people to have a safe space to communicate and to speak. I know that as a psychologist, I have people to come in, and that's the first thing that they may say to me is that I just need someone to listen. Right? I just need someone to hear me. I just need to talk with someone who I believe will understand, right, what I'm going through, or the hurt and pain that I'm experiencing. And bridging this back to the topic at hand of racism, I've gotten that a lot more this year, honestly, from Black men, which is to me a very huge step with them accessing help. And I know that we have that as a part of one of our series. I think it's a part 4 of our series about men and how they're doing. But I have definitely seen a change in the population of people that I'm servicing. And I have noticed many more Black men coming in for treatment during this year of 2020, especially from maybe late spring, early summer up until now. It's been a huge increase. And a lot of that is because they're feeling threatened. They're feeling unsafe. They're feeling angry about what they have been witnessing and experiencing as Black men. And again, that psychological impact that it has been having on them, and how they're feeling in the workplace. And even sometimes how they may be projecting some of their anger onto others, right? Misplaced anger, that's real, that happens. Just like it happens for those of us who are of the Black community, where we feel like there is this judgment across all people within our race, that we sometimes, I think historically, a lot of people can identify with this idea that, you know, we feel like we're all judged, like we're kind of all put into the same boat and same category, like we're very monolithic, and we're not. But that the actions of one impacts the whole. And I think that psychologically, we carry that with us as a group of people. We will see that even in our own experiences of maybe if you hear a story, and if it's a bad story, like a lot of us are like, oh my gosh, I hope it's not one of us, right? Because we have internalized this idea that, oh no, if one person in our group does something wrong, now we're being judged by everybody. Now everyone's going to think that we're this type of people, and that we do things like this all the time. And so those things are very impactful. I know that I think we put out there on the flyer about this internalized racism, which is that we unconsciously accept that some of the racism or racist attitudes and stereotypes, they are really true. And so we act that way without even realizing that we're doing it. We can feel like our voice doesn't matter, because we can say that, well, we've kind of been treated that way oftentimes, that our voice doesn't matter. And so now we internalize it, and then we start to say it ourselves, like, well, no one's really going to listen to me, right? Because our voice doesn't matter. And so we find ourselves repeating those types of statements unconsciously, and we're completely unaware that we're even doing it. But those things are some of the other psychological impacts that racism can have on people. And I think that when we have conversations with other people, or even within our homes, I think that it is beneficial for us to speak openly and honestly. Again, people listening have come to realize that that's big for me, openly and honestly about these things. Is that what we find is that it's so important that when we're talking to our children, I think one thing that happens a lot in the African American community is that we're brought up hearing these like words of affirmation over ourselves. And we also are brought up, typically, these are general, there's always exceptions to every rule, right? But typically what you hear when you're talking to like a group of people within our ethnic group is that you find that you are brought up hearing words of affirmation about yourself, about your hair and your skin color, and how beautiful and gorgeous it is, and how versatile, you know, our hair is. And then we also are brought up to honor and to acknowledge the beauty in others.
Yes.
Right? That, yes, and see, she has blue eyes and blonde hair, and she's gorgeous, and she's pretty just like you are, and you just look different, but you're both equally beautiful, and God made you both, right? So that's something that, some things are very much so cultural, they're very culture specific, or they happen more in some cultures than others. But I think that as a whole, I think that when you talk to people of our ethnic group, what you'll find is that that was said a lot to us growing up. And so when we grow up and we see other people of different races, we tend not to question, oh, why is their hair this way? Why is their skin color this way? But what our children tend to experience is that when they are in situations where there's not a lot of them that look and have the same skin color, they experience being questioned. Why is your skin that color? Why is your hair like that? Why does your hair do that? There's a lot of questions and curiosity. And sometimes people will hear me say that and they will instantaneously say things like, oh, well, that's just because it's different to this group of people, and they're just curious, and that's all it is, without realizing that it can come across like you're critiquing, and like to be anything other than a certain race is different, or it's wrong, or it's subpar, it's odd, right? And I think a lot of that is because that same dialogue that we were raised with, typically speaking, is not very common oftentimes in other cultures where they're being raised with this idea that God made, or whoever the creator, maybe maybe someone doesn't believe in God, but that everyone is different, everyone is beautiful, right? There is no one standard, but that everyone has beauty, and everyone is different, and there's nothing wrong with that. And so I think that's another part. These issues of racism and the psychological impact of them. There was a study years ago that was done with dolls, and the preference for a Black doll or a white doll, and children who were Black were picking the white doll, and that became a very popular study where it was showing that the image of non-Black, right, cultures were being perceived as being superior to or better than the Black culture or Black group of people. And so I think that, when we talk about the impact of racism, I think it's important that we start early with trying to educate our children, all ethnic groups, of what is beautiful, and the fact that no one is more beautiful than, and openly talking to them so they're not shocked and surprised when they see someone who looks different. It's not like they're an experiment and they have to touch their hair or touch certain parts of, and try to figure out, what is this, right? That it's just very natural to expect that people will look different from what they look like, or what their family looks like.
Very good. Ebony, I see your hand raised. Is that from before, or do you have a new comment? It's not. I'm not sure.
That's from before. My apologies.
Okay. I just don't know how to erase it. Am I supposed to do it on my end? Anyone else have any other comments to state during this? Very good conversation, Dr. Jackson. I've learned a lot listening from the race. It's helping. It's really helpful. I'm always open to learn more. I don't think just as African Americans, we need to feel like we have all the answers, or even that we respond the best way in addressing our pain with racism. So you are opening up a lot of areas to consider and think about from both sides. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity to have such an open dialogue. I know that we've had some questions and comments, and I know we're kind of limited and we're winding down on time, but definitely if there's anyone who, has any other questions or comments or different view, something that can be insightful to everyone listening, I think that it would be great to bring that up now and really engage in that conversation, or at least start the conversation, because I think, Gail, that's the point of this. It's just to start the conversation. This dialogue and this live event is not to say that, what's being discussed here is like the end all be all. It's just to start the dialogue and helping people not just talk about racism for the sake of talking about racism, but helping people gain a better understanding of the impact of racism. And I think that has been something, at least for me, that I don't hear a lot about. We talk about the existence of it, but not necessarily the psychological aspect of it. and how it
Yes,
impacts
yes.
people and impacts our behavior and our emotions and our mood and how we interact with each other. If we can all continue to work on those key things that I think have become a theme with me tonight is openness and honesty, validation and empathy, awareness and acknowledgement, and then being conscientious in our behavior and what we say to each other, how we speak to each other. I think those things are what I have repeated throughout the conversation tonight. And I hope those are some things that people take with them and find their own way of applying those ideas and concepts and principles so that we can all collectively work toward making greater progress.
Love it. And I hope everyone, if it's just one thing, that you were able to take away something from this dialogue that impacted or educated or inspired or encouraged mental health series. So it's something mentally that boosts you to that next level of inspiration. And join more programs like this if you'd like to know more about racism or otherwise, because our next event will not be racism. Our next, we'll talk about it before we close, December 17th is How Are the Kids? And we're talking about during this pandemic, because as we are trying to educate about racism, there's a whole nother side that they're dealing with, and it's this pandemic right now. And some of us maybe only know the surface of what our kids are going through. Some may not know at all, or some may know completely. But how do you address what they're going through? How do you recognize the triggers or the symptoms of what they're going through? Dr. Jackson is going to join us again. Once again, it's December 17th at 6:30 p.m. She will be joined by additional special guest professionals that will speak on this. So I encourage you to register for the program on our website, novilibrary.org, to get the Zoom link for that. How you talk to your children about this pandemic and the things that they're feeling. If you want to kind of maybe give a little teaser of that, Dr. Jackson, I encourage you to, or maybe I just put you on the spot, whatever. You don't have to go into it, but what are some of the things you may cover with that? We're going to talk about, I have it on the flyer. And this is for what, teens, preteens, and maybe even the littler ones. Their stress, sadness, quiet, they could be distracted, they could be isolated. You know your child. So
Yeah,
that's what we're going to talk about.
absolutely. I think that with the teenage group and the topic that we're going to have next week, it's that teenage group, you know, they're so enmeshed with their social group and their friendship group. And for those of us who are adults, being able to listen in on that conversation next week can help us understand to a greater extent the level of impact that this pandemic has had on a population of people where socially and having relationship, I mean, we all talk about humans, we have relationship, that's what we do, we feed off of each other, but we also know from a psychological standpoint that those relationships at that teenage age is so critical and so important. It impacts their self-esteem. People, you have 60-year-olds talking about what happened as a teenager, right? You have people of older age. That's because it's a very impactful age and what has happened to them and their friendship groups. And so for them to be in this situation at this phase in their life, not being able to be around each other and socialize with each other and have that connection that's so important at this age, that's what we're going to be talking about next week, and how we can help our those who we know who are teenagers, how we can help them. And if those, you know, we have listeners who are parents, how we as parents can help our children, you know, and be able to listen and have empathy and validation, right? And not just blowing them off and saying, don't worry about it, you know, you're going to be fine, you don't need to be around all those friends anyway, right? Like being able to truly have a listening ear and having an open heart to our teenagers and our children.
Absolutely. I'm going to have a lot of questions for that one because I have a teenager who's kind of on the quiet side. So when you hear them always say, "Oh, I'm fine," I really want to know, should I look deeper into that? And then sometimes when I'm out in stores and I see smaller children, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you have on the mask and some chills, and how is that affecting them as well? So I'm looking forward to our next discussion. And for tonight, I'd like to thank everyone for participating with us this evening. Great conversation, and I look forward to having you join us again. Thank you for your time and have a good evening. Good night.
Good night. Thank you, Gail.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson.